All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started with chapter 25. There are 7 sections in this chapter. It's the longest one in the book, so we've got some work to do. And we'll get started here with section 1. And here's the question for you. Through the sit-ins, college students became the leading force for social change. In 1960, young black activists, along with a few whites in Raleigh, North Carolina, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which would work to replace segregation with a beloved community of racial justice and give blacks control over the decisions that affected their lives. Direct actions of many sorts followed the sit-ins. Blacks demanded access to segregated beaches and pools. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, launched the Freedom Rides. Integrated groups traveled on buses into the Deep South to force compliance with court orders banning segregation in interstate transportation. Violent mobs attacked them and burned the buses while police stood by. The Freedom Rides forced the federal desegregation of interstate transportation despite numerous arrests of activists. Escalating protests saw growing resistance by local authorities. Late in 1961, SNCC and other groups began a nonviolent campaign against racial discrimination in Albany, Georgia. The protests lasted a year, and demonstrators' filling of jails failed to win national sympathy. In late 1962, a court ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith, a black student. State police did nothing as a mob, encouraged by the state's governor, rioted. 2 were killed, and President Kennedy dispatched army troops to restore order. Protests crested in 1963 as demonstrations against inequalities in education, employment, and housing spread throughout the South. In 1 week in June, more than 15,000 were arrested in 186 cities. The wave of discontent culminated in Birmingham, Alabama, a Deep South city with a history of violence against blacks since World War II. When local blacks protesting for more economic opportunity and the desegregation of local business had little success, Martin Luther King Jr. came to the city. While in jail for violating a ban on demonstrations, King wrote his eloquent letter from Birmingham jail. King excoriated local clergy who asked for patience and recounted the daily abuses black Southerners faced. He asked white moderates to abandon fears of disorder and commit themselves to racial justice. When King decided to have black school children join the protests, the city's police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, ordered brutal attacks with nightsticks, fire hoses, and attack dogs. Televised images of the repression outraged national and world opinion and led Kennedy to begin to embrace the civil rights movement's goals. Leading businessmen, fearing damage to the city's reputation, ended the protests by desegregating stores and restaurants and by promising to hire blacks. Birmingham forced white Americans to decide whether they had more in common with citizens demanding basic rights or with violent segregationists. The assassination of Medgar Evers, an NAACP official in Mississippi, and the bombing of a black church in Birmingham that killed 4 young girls later in 1963 made the question more pointed. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 black and white Americans participated in the March on Washington, considered by many the high point of the civil rights movement. Organized by a coalition of civil rights, labor, and church groups, it was the largest protest in American history up to that time. Calling for jobs and freedom, the marchers called for passage of a civil rights bill in Congress, a public works program to fight unemployment, a minimum wage increase, and a law barring discrimination in employment. On the Lincoln Memorial steps, King said his most famous words in what is now known as his I Have a Dream speech. While the march showed the movement's potential, including unity between blacks and whites, it also showed the movement's limits. All the speakers were male, despite the critical role of women in the movement. Organizers also pressed SNCC leader John Lewis to remove militant messages from his speech. Civil rights activists resurrected the Civil War-era vision of the federal government as the custodian of American freedom, despite the decades-long promotion of segregation. However, black activists had a historical reason to turn to the national authorities rather than state and local offices, but it remained unclear whether the federal government would take up this responsibility. So, that's the end of section 1. We'll be back for section 2.